Welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we'll be discussing the global environmental crisis, the growth of the subject in modern times. The subject basically revolves in the context of the progress of human civilization, post-industrial revolution. 20th century witnessed two world wars, and towards the end of the Second World War, Americans had dropped two nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and thereafter the world, in order to prevent another world war, established an international organization known as the United Nations Organization. And this organization initially was focusing on, it was working very hard to prevent another world war. It was only trying to establish peace between the nations. But over a period of time, right from 1945 to approximately 1962, humanity's progress after the Second World War, we notice that we were focusing mostly on development, and the nations of the world were competing with each other with trying to develop, and nobody knew what development was. All the time they were thinking that industrialization per se was development. Urbanization was equated with development. As a result, we see the kind of industries and industrialization and urbanization that manifested in Europe and subsequently in America. That particular scenario during the early 70s, we can imagine when we go through the writings of Rachel Carson and others, we see those cities as, fully blackened, air pollution at its highest level, water pollution, and the whole of the cities were, contaminated. It was in this context that Rachel Carson, she wrote a wonderful book entitled The Silent Spring. This particular book sensitized America. It was discussed in the Security Council also. Even John F. Kennedy had spoken about it. The novel was serialized in the New York Times, and this had a telling impact. In other words, I can say that this is the book that compelled America to take a second look at the kind of development they were pursuing till then. We notice that the book inspired the Americans to organize the first Earth Day in 1970. It also influenced the United Nations Organization to organize the first UN Conference on Human Environment, and this was organized in the year 1972 in Stockholm, Sweden. The 1972 conference, it gave a big impetus to the growth of the subject. Environment as a subject came to occupy the agendas of the world, and it also was given the most important place in research and development in the universities of Europe and America. Very soon we realized, the world realized that, through the hundreds and thousands of articles that were published on this wonderful subject, and there we see that this subject was growing in different areas. And these areas of concern were subsequently brought out very well in the World Commission on Environment and Development report. These areas are, number one, the depletion of the ozone layer. Second is global warming. Third is the loss of biodiversity. Fourth, we have the problem of expanding deserts or desertification. And lastly, the danger from nuclear reactors and nuclear bombs.
The last 50 years witnessed an ever-increasing population. We also witnessed depletion of natural resources, and we have seen how poverty has affected several countries in Africa, in South Asia, how people they're virtually struggling to get a pot of water. Simultaneously, it was becoming increasingly difficult for people to continue to live in a decent way in the cities. The problem with Europe and America is that the urbanization was very casual, haphazard, negligent, and industrialization also was on the same model. None of the European or American countries ever conducted an environmental impact assessment as to what would be the impact of the development they designed on the environment and people. As a result, that growth for growth's sake model or industry for industry's sake model had virtually destroyed the European and American cities, and industries were simply belching out smoke and liquid effluents were being discharged into the rivers. As a result, it resulted in ever increasing levels of air pollution and water pollution. Rachel Carson, an environmental biologist, she was actually working on the impact of DDT on different forms of life, because those days, the period immediately after the Second World War, malaria emerged as a major killer, and the world was compelled, the scientific community, the medical profession, they all recommended the usage of DDT, and very soon it was used extensively. Sometimes it appeared as if the world had waged a war on the mosquito. And DDT was there in the air, in the water. Very extensive usage. Nobody bothered its implications. But Rachel Carson very soon changed, and people like her, scientists like her, they really studied the impact of DDT on different forms of life, on the food chains and food webs. And there were several startling revelations. The impact of DDT and other pesticides on the food chains and food webs was studied extensively, and Rachel Carson published a book entitled Silent Spring. And I can say that this is the book that has launched the environmental revolution. Actually, it set off the environmental movement in America. It led to the Water Quality Act of 1965 and the Earth Day. America came to have Environmental Protection Agency. This is popularly known as EPA, and this was established to limit pollution, protect the environment, and clean up the polluted sites in America. After the publication of this book, United Nations, inspired by Rachel Carson's publication, organized what popularly came to be known as the United Nations Conference on Human Environment. And this was organized in Stockholm, Sweden, and it was inaugurated on June 5th, and that is why June 5th of every year is observed as the World Environment Day. But 1972 is also important for another reason, because in this year we see the publication of one of the most inspiring books again, and the name of the book is Limits to Growth. This was the publishers were the Club of Rome, and of course 5-6 authors have written, and the first author's name is Dennis Meadows. Dennis Meadows is one of the leading contributors of that particular book, and this book focuses on the two major limits of growth. Number one, the depletion of natural resources, and two is the increasing cost of pollution. But when we go through the subject of environment, we realize that a whole lot of books have really contributed. particularly after 1972, when this particular topic, when environment came to occupy the top of the agendas in several universities, it became a focus area for research. But prior to it, long back, in the 19th century itself, we have Henry David Thoreau and his wonderful book Walden, The Life in the Woods. It was published in 1854 and subsequently a series of books. And then we come to 1973, where Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, Economics as if People Mattered. This is the book which once again compelled the Europeans to think. But after 1973, we have the World Watch Institute publications. Every year they publish the State of the World reports, and they 1993 onwards, 1993, not 1973, they have been publishing, and it's a wonderful, these reports are excellent. I would strongly recommend all the PG students to go through them. World Watch Institute, Washington Publications. In India, we have Center for Science and Environment, Delhi, started by Anil Agarwal and presently headed by Ms. Sunita Narayan. And above all these things, we have the excellent writings of Mahatma Gandhi. To review the literature in this very important subject, we can quickly go through some of the major publications, beginning with Henry David Thoreau's Walden, The Life in the Woods, published in 1854. A Sand County Almanac and Sketches Here and There, 1949, by Aldo Leopard. The Tragedy of the Commons by Garrett Hardin, 1968. The Population Bomb, 1968. Small is Beautiful by Schumacher, 1973. And most important, World Watch Institute, Washington, publications since 1993. In India, we have the Center for Environment in New Delhi, and their publications are excellent, particularly their reports on India's status of environment and development, and other publications, including their fortnightly Down to Earth. I strongly recommend that we need to go through all this literature. Finally, all the writings of Mahatma Gandhi, because Gandhi is the best face when it comes to the expression of the subject of environment. His very famous dictum that there is enough in nature to meet the needs of all, but not sufficient to satisfy the greed of the few, is quoted worldwide in all the universities and in all the international conferences. As a result of the Stockholm Conference, which was held in 1972, the subject of environment came to occupy a top place in the agendas of the world while planning their economies and trying to protect their environment. United Nations, after going through the literature and going through the number of articles that were published subsequent to 1972, they established a commission known as the World Commission on Environment and Development. It was established in the year 1983. It was headed by Mrs. Gro Harlem Brundtland, former Prime Minister of Norway, and popularly it is known as the Brundtland Commission. The Commission submitted its report in 1987, and this report was adopted by the global community at a conference known as the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, popularly known as the Earth Summit, in 1992 at Rio. The World Commission on Environment and Development has listed 5 major issues at the global level, and these are: number 1, the depletion of the ozone layer; second is global warming; third is the loss of biodiversity; fourth is spreading desertification or desertization; and the fifth is the danger from nuclear bombs and nuclear reactors. But the second part of the report is equally interesting. This focuses on how to organize development. The challenges before the governments of the world in organizing development to meet the essential needs of the poorest of the poor. And this is where the public policies come directly into the picture. No two countries in the world are similar. There are lots of differences in terms of environment, in terms of the levels of development of the people. And that's why every country will be unique and every government will have its own problems and challenges. There are limits on the part of the government, there are limits on the part of the citizens. But then there are certain policies which need to be focused on. For example, the agriculture policy, urbanization, industrialization, public health, and other connected policies, education. Now, the challenge before the governments is how to fulfill the essential needs of the world's poor, right? At the same time, focusing on the quality and ensuring a very high level of integrity and transparency. Sustainable development has been defined by the Brundtland Commission as the ability to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. We come to 1992, when the United Nations organized the very famous, it's known as the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. This was organized in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, exactly 20 years after the Stockholm Conference. Actually, this conference, the Rio Conference, is the biggest of its kind ever held. It is known as the Earth Summit, and it laid down certain basic principles and it initiated certain measures to protect the planet Earth. And that is those measures are the following. Basically, this particular Rio Conference, it generated tangible sense of optimism, because till then it was doubtful whether the world will come together to address these issues. But then what the world witnessed at Rio was that the nations of the world slowly learned to come together and learn to make a common cause of the common threats to the planet Earth, because the world was interested in ensuring that the common future of humanity would be sustainable. So this Earth Summit adopted Agenda 21, a blueprint for sustainable development. Actually, this Agenda 21 can be described as a package of practices which the nations of the world had to adopt, had to bring about certain structural changes in their own countries, come up with policies and initiatives and, build institutions, prepare their respective countries to enter the 21st century or the new millennium on an eco-friendly, environment-friendly, people-friendly mode. Rio Declaration created what came to be known later as the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. It also created, Convention on Biological Diversity, and saw the creation of a UN Commission on Sustainable Development. Agenda 21, of course, it is in 4 parts. The first one deals with the social and economic dimension. Second is conservation and management of resources. Third is the strengthening the role of major stakeholders. And the fourth one is the action plan. Now we come to the 5 major issues, and I would like to focus on 2 to begin with. The first one is the depletion of the ozone layer. Actually, ozone is O3. It's a poisonous, toxic, hazardous, dangerous killer gas. If released in our lecture hall, everybody would be dead and gone. But when this gas is located at a height of, in the space, known as the lower stratosphere, there between the 15th kilometer and the 30th kilometer, if this gas, that is, if the ozone molecules are there in sufficient numbers, they very effectively come together to stop the incoming damage-causing short-wave sun rays and thereby protect life on the planet Earth. This is the chemistry of the ozone depletion. Basically, UV ultraviolet radiation causes a chlorine atom to break away from CFC molecule, and then the free chlorine atom hits an ozone molecule. The chlorine atom pulls one oxygen atom away. A free oxygen atom hits the chlorine monoxide molecule, and the result is another free chlorine atom. Here, the chlorine atom acts as a catalyst and continues with its mission of breaking the ozone molecules. United Nations, perceiving the dangers from the depletion of the ozone layer, they organized very famous Vienna Convention for the protection of the ozone layer. Actually, it was a multilateral environmental agreement, but it really did not fulfill the desired, to the extent desired. There were some lapses. United Nations later on, very soon, because in view of the urgency of the matter, they convened another global meeting in Montreal, Canada, and a protocol was the outcome. This Montreal protocol is very, very famous because the global community came together and they decided to stop the production and usage of ozone depleting substances. It was agreed on 16th of September 1987 and it came into force from 1st January 1989. 16th of September every year is observed as the Ozone Protection Day. The next important problem faced by the planet Earth is global warming, and here we have three gases which contribute to global warming. One is carbon dioxide, second is methane, third is nitrous oxide. The CO2 levels have been increasing ever since since 1950 onwards. Initially they were around 300, we had 300 ppm. The CO2 molecules were just 300 ppm, but now it has exceeded the 400 mark. In other words, in terms of percentage, it was what was 0.03%, it has exceeded 0.04, and this is causing alarm. The more the CO2 in the air, the greater the temperature trapped, and this phenomenon is known as global warming. As a result of this, the global average temperatures are increasing, and it is having a telling impact on the climate. And then in the next lecture we'll discuss the climate change.
The first part of the lecture we focused on the emergence of the subject. The conditions that were existing prior to 1962, I have already pointed out that industries were belching out smoke and they were releasing effluents into the water bodies, and most of the cities in Europe and America were full of smoke. It was affecting their quality of life. Under such situation, Rachel Carson's initiative made all the difference. But subsequently, thanks to that book, we can safely say that the world was awakened. It was compelled to take a second look at the kind of development they were pursuing till then. An awakened America immediately took action. An awakened United Nations took the initiative, and we had the Stockholm Conference, and after that several universities connected with this subject. There was a tremendous growth of literature, and we have reviewed the literature there. Now, after taking cognizance of all this, United Nations, they came up with the World Commission report, and that report was wonderful. They highlighted the major issues the planet Earth was facing, and also they focused, for the first time, the report focused on development and said that it should be sustainable, and they have defined sustainable development. From here, we notice that in order to ensure that development should be sustainable, United Nations, they came up with solutions to the ozone depletion, global warming, and the first part basically prepared the world to enter the 21st century or the new millennium on an environment-friendly note.